How Australia is silently bankrolling the entire South Pacific. The country's on the Aussie Payroll. Right now, while you're watching this, Australia is quietly writing checks worth billions of dollars to countries most people can't even find on a map, and it's creating one of the most controversial economic experiments in modern history. We're talking about 9 Pacific nations that depend on Australian aid for anywhere between 20 to 83% of their entire national budgets. Let me say that again, 83%. That means without Australian money, some of these countries literally couldn't pay their teachers, police officers, or nurses. But wait, before we begin, please subscribe to ensure that you never miss out on any of my essential stuff. Comment, I subscribe below, and I will personally welcome you to our community. With that said, let's get started. In 2023 alone, Australia spent $1.4 billion on Pacific aid. That's more per capita than the United States spends on its NATO allies. To put that in perspective, that's enough to buy every single person in Tonga a $1,400 gift card. Every single year. But here's the thing. This isn't charity. This is strategy. And China is watching every single transaction, calculating every vulnerability, and making counteroffers that would make your head spin. Before we count down which countries are on the Aussie Payroll, you need to understand why this matters. Not just to geopolitics nerds, but to you. The Pacific Islands represent 2.3 million people scattered across an ocean larger than Russia. Sounds insignificant, right? Wrong. These tiny nations control exclusive economic zones that contain 19% of the world's tuna supply and shipping lanes carrying $5.3 trillion in trade annually. Your iPhone components, your Amazon packages, your morning coffee, odds are they pass through waters controlled by these islands. Whoever controls these islands controls the Pacific, and potentially the future of global trade and military dominance in the Asia-Pacific region. Even if you never heard of Kiribati or Nauru, your life is connected to them in ways you never imagined. So let's count down the countries on Australia's payroll, from least to most financially dependent. And trust me, when we get to number 1, you're going to question everything you thought you knew about foreign aid. Fiji. You know it as a luxury resort destination where celebrities go to disconnect from the world. Crystal blue waters, overwater bungalows, $500 a night resorts. But there's a $240 million secret hiding beneath that postcard-perfect surface. 15% of Fiji's national budget, $240 million annually, comes directly from Australian aid. Now, compared to the others on this list, Fiji is practically independent. But here's what makes it fascinating. Fiji has options. With 900,000 people and a relatively stable economy built on tourism and sugar exports, they could theoretically go elsewhere for support. Meet Ravi. He's 34, worked at a resort in Nadi for 12 years. When COVID-19 hit in 2020, tourism collapsed overnight. Fiji lost 82% of its GDP in 3 months. Ravi lost his job, couldn't pay rent, moved back in with his parents with his wife and 2 kids. Then, an Australian-funded infrastructure project started building climate-resilient resorts designed to withstand Category 5 cyclones. Ravi got hired as a foreman. That Australian money didn't just give him a paycheck. It gave him specialized instruction training he never would have accessed otherwise. Australia's money in Fiji goes towards cyclone-resistant buildings, renewable energy grids, and police training programs. Sounds straightforward, right? But here's what the tourism brochures don't tell you. In 2022, China proposed funding a police training facility in Suva, Fiji's capital. Sounds innocent, except the blueprints look suspiciously like the overseas Chinese police stations that have been popping up in dozens of countries. Stations that human rights groups say China uses to monitor and intimidate dissidents abroad. After intense diplomatic pressure from Australia and a quiet $30 million increase in Australian police aid, Fiji rejected the Chinese proposal. So here's the question. Was that Fiji's decision? Or did Australia make that decision for them with a checkbook? If Australia has this much influence in Fiji, a relatively stable economy, imagine what happened in the smaller islands where dependence isn't 15%, it's 5 times higher. Samoa, population, 200,000. Australian aid, $180 million annually. That's 32% of Samoa's national budget. Let's do the math on that. $180 million for 200,000 people equals $900 per person per year. For context, many Samoans earn around $700 per month. Australia is literally subsidizing nearly 15% of the average person's annual income through government services. Australian money paid for the undersea internet cables connecting Samoa to the world. Without those cables, you're living in digital darkness. No Zoom calls, no remote work, no streaming services. Australia funded the hospital equipment in Apia's main hospital. They financed disaster response systems that activate when cyclones hit. This is Lena. She's 28, a nurse at Tupua Tamasi's Mayo Hospital in Apia. 3 years ago, her sister came in for a routine pregnancy checkup. Using an Australian-donated ultrasound machine, Lena detected placenta previa, a complication that could have killed both her sister and nephew during delivery. Because of that machine, paid for by Australian taxpayers, they scheduled a C-section. 2 lives saved, 1 ultrasound machine. But this dependence creates a dangerous vulnerability. In 2019, a measles outbreak tore through Samoa. 83 people died, mostly children, because vaccination rates had dropped. Within 48 hours of Samoa's emergency request, Australian military aircraft were landing with vaccines, medical teams, and emergency supplies. The World Health Organization estimates that Australian intervention prevented an additional 50 to 60 deaths. But here's the uncomfortable truth. When your nation's health infrastructure depends on another country's generosity, what happens when that generosity comes with conditions? In 2020, China offered Samoa $500 million to build a deep water port capable of hosting naval vessels. $500 million. That's 2.7 times what Australia gives them annually. For a country like Samoa, that's transformational money. Australia countered with $700 million in infrastructure upgrades spread over 10 years, but with explicit conditions. No Chinese military access, no ports that could host military vessels, and continued alignment with Australia on UN votes related to Taiwan and South China Sea disputes. Samoa took the Australian money, but was that a choice or an economic hostage situation? And here's the thing. Samoa isn't even close to the most dependent nation on this list. Wait until you see number 3. Okay, we need to pause and talk about why this matters beyond just dollars and cents. Because there's a shadow player in every single one of these stories. China. In April 2022, the Solomon Islands, a nation that had been in Australia's sphere of influence for decades, signed a security pact with China. The details were kept secret, but leaked drafts showed provisions allowing Chinese naval vessels, troop deployments, and potential military bases just 2,000 kilometers from Brisbane. Australian intelligence officials described it as a worst-case scenario. Within 6 months, Australia had increased Pacific aid by 23%, the largest single-year jump in 15 years. Former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull called the Pacific competition with China the most significant foreign policy challenge since World War II. Think about that. Not terrorism. Not trade wars, the Pacific Islands. Because here's what most people don't realize. 70% of global shipping passes through these waters. If China gains military access to Pacific ports, they can potentially monitor, disrupt, or even blockade the maritime trade routes that keep the entire Western economy functioning. So when you hear about Australian aid to these islands, understand, this isn't about generosity. It's about preventing Chinese military bases from being built within striking distance of Australian cities. Now, let's get to nations where dependence stops being a policy choice and starts becoming an economic reality they can't escape. Vanuatu. This is where things get really interesting. Australian aid, $140 million annually. National budget dependence, 45%. Population, 300,000 people spread across 83 islands. But here's what makes Vanuatu absolutely fascinating from a geopolitical standpoint. They're playing Australia and China like a chess match, and somehow getting away with it. Vanuatu accepts massive Australian aid while maintaining diplomatic relations with both Taiwan and Beijing, a nearly impossible balancing act. They vote with China on South China Sea disputes at the UN, but partner with Australia on climate and security initiatives. This is Jack. He's 45, father of 3 in Port Vila. His kids attend an Australian-built school with free textbooks, free meals, and rooms that double as cyclone shelters during disaster season. 80% of Vanuatu schools are funded by Australian aid. 60% of health clinics depend on Australian medical supplies and training. Without that aid, Jack's kids don't go to school. It's that simple. In April 2020, Category 5 cyclone Harold slammed into Vanuatu with 2 15-kilometer-per-hour winds. It destroyed 90% of buildings on some islands. Within 72 hours, Australian Defence Force aircraft were delivering 100 tons of emergency supplies, water purification systems, medical kits, temporary shelters, satellite communication equipment. They didn't ask permission. They didn't wait for a formal request. They just showed up, because when you're financially dependent on someone, they have access to your emergencies. But here's where it gets controversial. In 2021, Vanuatu's Prime Minister quietly began negotiating with China for a $300 million port development project on the island of Espiritu Santo. Not just any port, a deep water facility capable of hosting military vessels. When Australia's intelligence services caught wind of it, they didn't ask nicely. They threatened to pull $50 million in direct budget support, money that pays for government salaries and essential services. Within weeks, the Chinese port deal quietly collapsed. No official announcement. Just gone. So here's the uncomfortable question. Is this aid, or is this economic coercion dressed up in humanitarian packaging? When a country depends on you for 45% of their budget, can they really say no to your demands? Is that partnership, or is that control? And if you think that level of dependence is extreme, the next 2 countries will completely redefine what you think aid relationships look like. Because we're about to enter territory where economic dependence becomes economic existence. Nauru. Let me start with this. At just 8.1 square miles, this is the smallest island nation on Earth. You could fit it inside Manhattan's Central Park with room to spare. And Australia controls 60% of its national budget. $35 million for 12,000 people. But to understand how Nauru ended up on Australia's payroll, you need to know their tragedy. For most of the 20th century, Nauru was rich. Filthy rich. The island was basically one giant phosphate deposit. Bird droppings accumulated over millions of years, creating one of the world's richest fertilizer sources. At their peak in the 1970s and 80s, Nauruans had one of the highest per capita incomes on the planet. They had trust funds, investments, real estate in Hawaii and Australia. The government promised generational wealth. Then the phosphate ran out. By the mid-1990s, 90% of Nauru's surface had been strip-mined into an uninhabitable moonscape. The trust funds had been mismanaged and embezzled. Unemployment hit 90%. The economy collapsed. Nauru had literally sold its soul, its land, its resources, its future, and gotten nothing sustainable in return. Enter Australia with a deal that's as controversial as it is financially essential. Starting in 2001, Australia began paying Nauru to house asylum seekers, refugees trying to reach Australia by boat. It's called the Pacific Solution, and human rights groups call it offshore detention dressed up as processing. This single contract represents 50% of Nauru's economy. 50%. The processing center employs hundreds of Nauruans. It requires logistics, food services, security, medical staff, infrastructure maintenance. Entire families depend on it. Meet Tala. He's 52, works as a security guard at the processing center. His daughter is in university in Fiji, tuition paid for by his salary. His son has a small business in Nauru's capital that supplies food to the facility. His wife works in administration there. For members of his immediate family are employed directly or indirectly by this Australian contract. Here's the moral complexity that makes this so difficult. Without Australian money, Nauru's economy collapses overnight. Unemployment goes back to 90%. The government can't pay salaries. The country descends into economic chaos. But the processing center has been condemned by UN human rights experts for indefinite detention, inadequate mental health services, and reports of abuse. In 2023, a UN Special Rapporteur called conditions a form of systematic psychological torture. Australia's response? Fund renewable energy projects, solar panel installations, desalination plants, diversification initiatives. Look, we're helping them build a future beyond the detention center. But 2023 independent audit revealed that 83% of Nauru's government employees are still paid through Australian-linked funding streams. The solar panels exist, but they haven't replaced the economic model. So what would you do? If you're Nauru's president, do you shut down the detention center on moral grounds and watch your nation collapse? Or do you take the money, employ your people, and live with the ethical compromise? Because if you think that's an impossible situation, wait until you see number one. What's happening in the next country isn't just economic dependence. It's existential. We're talking about a nation that is literally, physically disappearing. And Australia is funding its slow extinction. Tuvalu, population, 11,000. Australian aid, $45 million annually. National budget dependence, 83%. 83%. Let me break down how absolutely insane that number is. That's $4,090 per person per year. The average annual income in Tuvalu is around $3,800. Australia is giving Tuvalu more per capita than most Tuvaluans earn themselves. Without Australian money, the government of Tuvalu literally cannot function. Schools close. Hospitals shut down. Police and teachers don't get paid. But here's what makes Tuvalu's situation uniquely heartbreaking. This isn't just economic dependence. This is funding a countdown to extinction. Tuvalu's highest point is 4.5 meters above sea level. That's about 15 feet. A two-story building is taller than the highest point in the entire country. And with sea levels rising at 3.9 millimeters per year, accelerating due to climate change, scientists predict Tuvalu will be uninhabitable by 2050. Some studies say as early as 2040. This isn't theoretical. During king tides, seawater floods the main island of Funafuti. Homes flood. The airstrip, the only airstrip connecting Tuvalu to the outside world, goes underwater. Saltwater intrusion is killing crops. Freshwater supplies are being contaminated. In 2023, Australia and Tuvalu signed the Falapili Union Treaty. It allows 280 Tuvaluans to migrate to Australia every year as climate refugees, with full residency rights and a pathway to citizenship. It's the first treaty of its kind, recognizing climate displacement as a refugee category. Sounds humanitarian, right? But buried in that treaty are exclusive military access rights. Australia gets to place military assets on Tuvalu territory. No consultation with other countries required. No Chinese port developments. No alternative security partnerships. This is Malia. She's 29, a teacher in Funafuti, Tuvalu's capital. Twice a year, king tides flood her classroom. She watches seawater seep under the door while she's teaching 8-year-olds about mathematics and science. Australian aid built raised platforms for the desks so the kids can keep learning even when there's 2 inches of water on the floor. Think about that. A classroom designed to function while partially flooded. Malia has a 4-year-old daughter, and she asks herself the same question every single day. Do I raise my daughter in a country that won't exist when she's my age? Or do I take the Australian visa, move to Brisbane, and lose our language, our culture, our entire identity? Her daughter will never know what it's like to grow up Tuvaluan. There won't be a Tuvalu to return to. Australia funds seawall construction in Tuvalu. They finance elevated buildings. They pay for climate adaptation research. But here's the brutal reality. Everyone involved knows these are temporary measures. A 2023 study from the University of Auckland, published in Nature Climate Change, calculated that Tuvalu would need $450 million annually in climate adaptation infrastructure to remain inhabitable until 2060. They're receiving $45 million. They're $405 million short. Every single year, the seawalls by them may be 20 or 30 years. The raised buildings delay the inevitable, but the ocean is coming, and everyone knows it. And here's the geopolitical kicker. In 2022, China offered to fund the entire climate adaptation program, $450 million annually. They'd build the seawalls, the elevated infrastructure, the desalination plants, everything. The catch? Exclusive diplomatic recognition, cutting ties with Taiwan, and allowing Chinese research vessels, which intelligence analysts believe means military surveillance ships, to dock in Tuvalu's waters. Australia's response? They increased aid to Tuvalu by 40% in 2023 and secured those exclusive military access rights through the Phalappili Union Treaty. So let's be blunt about what's actually happening here. Australia isn't saving Tuvalu. They can't. The math doesn't work. The funding isn't enough. The climate crisis is too far advanced. What Australia is doing is buying time, 20, maybe 30 years, to slowly evacuate 11,000 people while maintaining strategic military access to their exclusive economic zone. They're not funding a nation's future. They're funding a managed extinction while securing geopolitical advantage. And here's the question nobody wants to ask. Is that wrong? If Tuvalu is doomed anyway, is it better to have Australia manage the transition, providing migration pathways, maintaining services, offering dignity in departure, than to let China do it? Or is this just colonialism with a climate change rebrand? Because make no mistake, by 2060, Tuvalu will likely be a government in exile operating from Brisbane, managing fishing rights and maritime zones for a country that exists only on maps. Okay, before you type Australian imperialism in the comments, we need to talk about the other side of the story. Because as controversial as this aid dependence is, there's a perspective that challenges everything we've just discussed. Without Australian aid, what's the alternative for these nations? Let's look at what's actually happened in countries that went all in on Chinese investment. Sri Lanka borrowed $1.4 billion from China to build Hambantota Port. When they couldn't repay the debt, China took a 99-year lease on the port in 2017. Sri Lanka lost sovereignty over strategic infrastructure on their own soil for basically a century. Here's the critical difference. Australian aid primarily comes as grants, money that doesn't need to be repaid. Chinese investment overwhelmingly comes as loans, with 3 to 6% interest rates and collateral requirements. When you can't pay, China takes assets. A 2024 report from the Lowy Institute, an independent Australian think tank, surveyed 10,000 Pacific Islanders across all major island nations about their perceptions of foreign aid and investment. The results? 68% view Australian aid as beneficial with conditions compared to 34% for Chinese investment. Pacific Islanders themselves, when surveyed anonymously, prefer the Australian model 3-to-1 over Chinese loans. Pacific leaders watch what happened in Sri Lanka. They watched Chinese debt-trap diplomacy play out in Africa and Southeast Asia. And they made calculated decisions about which external partner posed less long-term risk. Fiji's former Prime Minister Frank Bainimarama said in 2023, Australian aid comes with strings, but Chinese loans come with chains. At least with Australia, we're arguing with family. With China, we're negotiating with a bank that will foreclose on our future. This isn't black and white. It's not heroes versus villains. It's a spectrum of gray with billions of dollars, regional security, and the futures of 2.3 million people at stake. Australia's aid model has problems: economic coercion, conditional support, strategic self-interest masquerading as humanitarianism. But the alternative isn't independence. For most of these nations, true economic independence hasn't been realistic for decades, if it ever was. The real question is, who do you want to depend on? The democratic neighbor with cultural ties and mutual security interests? Or the authoritarian superpower with a track record of debt colonialism? So where's this all heading? Because what's happening right now in the Pacific isn't the end game. It's the opening moves of a much longer chess match. By 2030, Australia has committed to spending $2 billion annually on Pacific aid. That's a 42% increase from 2023 levels. They're not pulling back. They're doubling down. Meanwhile, climate scientists project that 5 to 8 Pacific nations may become partially or fully uninhabitable by 2070. We're talking about the potential displacement of 2.3 million people over the next 45 years. Where do they go? Australia has committed to accepting climate refugees from Tuvalu. But what about Kiribati? The Marshall Islands? Nauru? Will Australia open permanent migration pathway for all of them? Because here's the brutal geopolitical reality. The Pacific is becoming the new Cold War battleground. But instead of nuclear missiles and ideological proxy wars, countries are deploying checkbooks and infrastructure projects. And here's why you watching this video from wherever you are in the world, should actually care about Pacific Island aid politics. If Pacific shipping lanes are disrupted due to Chinese military presence or regional instability, global trade models predict a 15 to 20% increase in consumer goods prices. Your iPhone gets more expensive. Your Amazon deliveries take longer. Your grocery bills go up. If China establishes military bases in Pacific, it directly threatens the Australia-New Zealand-United States Defense Alliance, the cornerstone of Western military strategy in the Indo-Pacific for 70 years. Suddenly, Chinese naval vessels can monitor, track, and potentially interdict U.S. military movements. And then there's the ethical crisis that nobody wants to confront. Are we watching the slow-motion ethnic cleansing of an entire region by rising sea levels? When Tuvalu disappears, when Kiribati's islands flood, when entire cultures dissolve into diaspora communities scattered across Australia and New Zealand. What do we call that? Is it a climate tragedy? Or is it the 21st century version of colonialism, where developed nations burn the fossil fuels that raise the oceans and now offer migration opportunities to people whose homes they destroyed? Because we need to address the elephant in the room, the part of the story that makes Australia's entire aid narrative fall apart under scrutiny. Australia is the world's third largest fossil fuel exporter. In 2023, Australian coal and natural gas exports generated approximately 1.1 billion tons of CO2 emissions. For context, the entire Pacific Islands region, all 2.3 million people, produces about 15 million tons of CO2 annually. Australia's fossil fuel exports generate 73 times more carbon emissions than all Pacific nations combined. And Australia isn't slowing down. They're expanding. New coal mine approvals, massive LNG export projects, while simultaneously funding seawalls for nations drowning from the emissions their exports enable. At the 2024 Pacific Islands Forum in Tonga, Vanuatu's climate minister delivered a speech that went viral. Australia is handing us life jackets while steering the Titanic toward the iceberg. They're building our seawalls with one hand and mining the coal that melts the ice caps with the other. Tuvalu's prime minister was even more blunt. Australian aid is conscience money. They're paying us to forgive them for drowning us. Australia's defense? Fossil fuel exports support 80,000 direct jobs and contribute $50 billion annually to the Australian economy. Shutting down coal and gas would devastate regional communities, especially in Queensland and Western Australia. So here's the impossible choice. Should Australia sacrifice 80,000 jobs and $50 billion in annual revenue to reduce emissions and save Pacific Island nations? Or is it rational for them to prioritize their own economic interests while providing aid to manage the consequences? There's no easy answer. Because if Australia shuts down fossil fuel exports tomorrow, China and Indonesia will simply increase their production to fill the gap. Global emissions might not even decrease. The production just moves somewhere else. But if Australia keeps expanding fossil fuels, they're actively accelerating the climate crisis that's destroying their nearest neighbors. Neighbors they claim to care about enough to send billions in aid. Is that aid? Or is that blood money? Is it humanitarian assistance? Or is it hush money to delay difficult conversations about climate justice and historical responsibility? And perhaps most uncomfortably, if you were in Australia's position, balancing domestic economic needs against regional climate catastrophe, what would you actually do? All right, we've gone deep into the economics, the geopolitics, the moral complexity, and the climate crisis. We've looked at 5 countries whose entire existence depends on Australian checks clearing every month. We've seen how aid becomes leverage, how climate change turns entire nations into geopolitical bargaining chips, and how the Pacific is becoming the testing ground for a 21st century power competition. So here's my question for you, and I genuinely want to know what you think. If you were the Australian Prime Minister right now, What would you do? Option A. Keep writing billion-dollar checks. Maintain the status quo. Accept that you're creating permanent economic dependence, but argue it's better than Chinese control. You're securing regional stability and military access, but you're also essentially owning these nations' futures. Option B. Pull back funding. Force these nations to diversify their partnerships. Accept that some will align with China, but argue that true sovereignty means letting them make their own choices, even if those choices threaten Australian security interests. You're respecting independence, but potentially losing the Pacific to a geopolitical rival. Option C. Triple down on climate action. Massively reduce or phase out fossil fuel exports, even if it costs 80,000 Australian jobs and $50 billion in annual revenue. Increase Pacific aid to fully fund climate adaptation. Argue that Australia has a moral obligation to fix the problem they helped create. You're taking responsibility, but asking Australian workers to pay the price. Drop a comment right now, A, B, or C, and here's the hard part. Explain your reasoning. Don't just pick one. Tell me why. What are you willing to sacrifice? What are your priorities? Economic interests? Regional security? Climate justice? Moral responsibility? Because if you think this story is complicated, wait until you see what we're covering next. How these tiny Pacific Island nations are voting as a bloc at the United Nations and swinging global decisions on everything from climate policy to human rights resolutions. These countries that depend on Australian aid, they each get one vote at the UN, same as the United States, same as China. And they're using those votes strategically in ways that are reshaping international diplomacy. That story is even crazier than this one. So subscribe right now. Hit the notification bell, because what happens in the Pacific doesn't stay in the Pacific. These tiny islands are literally and figuratively shaping the future, whether they're above water or below it.